sustainable world. So to the extent that you like watching The Walking Dead or Game of Thrones, to the extent that you sort of suspect that it wasn't a coincidence that David Bowie and Prince died in the same year that the United States and the UK threw themselves off of the geopolitical cliff, to the extent that we feel this, we are all apocalypticists.
I
Now,
love it.
Apocalypticism is paralyzing, and in the face of very real crises that are barreling towards us, it is masturbatory.
Yes.
The antidote to apocalypticism is apocalyptic civics. Apocalyptic civics is the insistence that we cannot ignore the truth, nor should we panic about it. It is a shared consciousness that our institutions have failed and our ecosystem is collapsing, yet we are still here, and we are creative agents who can shape our own destinies. Apocalyptic civics is the conviction that the only way out is through, and the only way through is together. So, the really important thing to remember is that everything dies. We all die, unless one of you is Peter Thiel's super secret cyber sex slave. We're all gonna die. But even as old worlds fall away, new ones are constantly emerging. Ingrid Burrington recently had a panel called Apocalyptic Buffering at the Theorizing the Web conference, and she and her panelists talked about how the very premise of the United States, it's founded upon multiple apocalyptic events: the arrival of colonialists in the United States, the arrival of the slave trade in Africa. These were apocalyptic events for entire civilizations, and our civilization has this notion that we're the city on the hill, redeeming ourselves from that narrative. And I would suggest that true redemption would actually entail grappling with that history and with the crises that are coming our way. And we're going to be able to hear about that from these awesome panelists that we have today. So, with that, I hope y'all chose your own apocalypse. We're going to be coming back to that later in this hour. And I'll introduce our first panelist will be Willow Brew.
Hooray!
Otherwise known as Willow Blue. Willow is a digital humanitarian who works with formal disaster response organizations and helps facilitate their cooperation with the emergent networks of mutual aid that naturally occur on site during times of disaster.
Maybe my presentation will load. It will be very exciting. Promise I won't make you seasick. Fingers crossed. If it loads. All right, so, whoa. Maybe it won't load at all. That's okay. Hey, friends. This is going to make the beginning of this really funny because in my line of work, what we plan for and what actually happens are never the same. And so one of the core organizing principles that I operate under is to expect the mess. How can we trust people in their moment of needs and in their moments of connections to make good choices for each other and to not try to dictate what actions will be. I don't necessarily, I see the value in the distributed model of we will delegate things to volunteers. That's vital for people understanding how they can get involved initially. But the next step after that is to trust people in making their own choices about their own environments. So, natural events, extreme natural events like earthquakes and volcanoes are only called disasters because we live there. And we continue focusing our populations, PS, invest in birth control and women's rights, etc. Our populations are growing very rapidly and we're condensing into places that are actually pretty prone to natural events. We're also increasing how many natural events there are. Earthquakes are one of the most stable events there can be, which is funny because they're earthquakes. But you'll see that what has been a linear graph is increasing mostly because of fracking. So we're actually, it's a stop hitting yourself moment, right? We're doing this to ourselves. And the entire way that we have set up aid, both humanitarian aid and disaster response, is incredibly colonial and paternalistic. We are assuming that people need help, that they need our attention in order to solve their problems. This is only one article that in a long list of them that talks about how we've really fucked up all of these ecosystems by the way that we get involved. And so, in short, this is my favorite comic that has to do with this, which is from A Softer World. People helping each other in the aftermath of tragedy is the only really convincing argument for people. But then when you mouse over it, it says, always in a shadow of a stronger argument against. So this is where I'm coming from. So this is me. This is a little bit more pixelated than I would like it to be, but that's fine. Life happens. And my guiding principle is it possible to perform mutual aid at a global scale? This is what the digital promise is to me, is that I can help people that are not just next to me, my neighbors that I have to help, and that I do, but also what is it for someone in Uganda to help map a crisis in San Francisco when we have our next earthquake, which is going to happen so soon. Oh my God. And a subsection of that is always asking who are the most invisible, who are the most marginalized, because if you're able to help them, everyone else is probably going to be fine. So I'll tell you in brief about Three Cities. We hear a lot about theory at this conference. I love theory, but the only way we get to the next theories and make mistakes for new and interesting reason is if we put all that theory into practice, and then hopefully in 5 years maybe, we should be like, oh man, here's this new problem that's emerged. And I'm so excited for that to happen. So, New York City during Sandy response, this new innovation or whatever you want to call it happened, where this is how people send in materials to resource centers. If you want to donate things, one, never donate clothes. Oh my God, never do it. But the government, NGOs, and private donations come in, and they all get unpacked out of their unlabeled boxes into things like church pews or whatever else, and then volunteers repackage them into what they think is still needed in a distant location. Right? It's chaos, and it's time-consuming, and it's terrible. What Occupy Sandy did was they put together an Amazon gift registry. And people were able to say exactly what they needed, and people were able to, from far away or locally, buy them exactly what they needed, and it was a direct link. And then we even connected with FedEx and UPS, et cetera. They were like, we have the shipping logistics down, why are you having us deliver it to you? We'll just deliver it directly to them. So it was amazing. And the thing in here to pay attention to is that we replace the centralization of logistics into a direct connection. Because some part of it is always going to be centralized, whether it's the data or it's the code or something, but it can be held in the open and distributed. This makes sense? Okay, cool. So that's one example. Oh my God. Maybe we only get 2 examples, and maybe this one will load. Okay, digital democracy in Port-au-Prince. I helped them with a group called COVIPI, which is Coalition of Victims for Victims. They were putting together a call center, and we had an international team coming in to help with a hackathon. And usually that would be them showing up and being like, we are the best, and we know all about the technology, and we'll just build this for you, no big deal, right? And then it would fall apart in the weeks afterward, if not in the moment. And instead we worked with women in the call center to define what their needs were, and then we worked with students in a local technical college to address those needs with some tech tools that we didn't even know about. Like, they pulled in some libraries that were like, well, I didn't even know that existed. It was great. The school and the call center worked together to continue supporting those students, both through credit and then through work, to maintain the database. I think it's still in use, and that was many years ago, and it was great, and it was super pixelated. That's fine. But, so from this, and this is a lesson that so many people here have already made, or already come to, is inclusion in the build is as if not more important than a functional tool or platform. So I'm excited. What are we going to learn from doing this more regularly now? We're going to make new mistakes. It's going to be awesome, but we need to stay grounded in this. I'm going to leave it there because other people should talk. Yeah, there you go. There are a bunch of other people who are awesome. I don't just try to sit in equality by myself because that would be boring and not work. So there are other people over here that are also awesome. Okay, cool. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay.
Let's see. We're going to hear from Ayana next. I have your slides. Ayana Johnson, Dr. Johnson, is she's a marine biologist, and she is the founder and principal of the Ocean Collective, which she'll tell you a little bit about, and also recently was one of the primary organizers of the March for Science. I met with her.
I got myself a gold ring that says science on it.
This is also Ayana's 9th panel this week.
7.
7th panel.
Let's not exaggerate. Thanks for that, Greg. So let me try to stabilize this so we don't all get seasick. It's like the low-tech Prezi, like post-apocalyptic Prezi. I really just was trying to be funny. Okay, so this is what I try to figure out. It's like, how can we use the ocean without using it up? And it turns out that's actually quite hard, especially because of climate change and coral bleaching. So this is a healthy reef. This is that reef a few months later. All the coral is about to die. This is a pile of sharks without fins. We've taken about 90% of most of the large predatory species out of the water since 1950. We're about to have more plastic than fish in the ocean by 2050. This is all like if we don't change our ways, of course. This is Greg's hometown of Miami and what we've done to the coastline there. And obviously, like that coastal ecosystem is no longer sustaining things. So we can't go back to pristine. There are just too many billions of people on the planet. But the sort of like pre-post-apocalypse revelation that I've had lately is, so we can't get back to 100 if this is 100. Well, there aren't really fish in this picture, so this is like about to fall too. But we can't go back to 100, but 0 is also untenable. But there's a huge spectrum in between that. So people say, like, are you hopeful that we can save coral reefs? My answer is no, but I'm fighting for 60% or 40%, which is a really big difference in 0. So this is a fisherman in Barbuda, a small island in the northeast corner of the Caribbean, showing me the one remaining coral on what used to be his favorite reef. So if we reduce these threats of climate change and pollution and overfishing, then these ecosystems can in fact recover, and we have a lot of evidence of that. And so the work that I've done is taking this approach of being comprehensive, so not just focusing on one small part of the problem, being science-based, but also community-driven. And doing those 3 things at the same time is kind of tricky. But I've done that, fun reformatting. I've done that through working on ocean zoning. So just like we do on land, you can zone the ocean, thinking about fishing areas and aquaculture areas and shipping and wind energy and tourism and protected areas being a big part of that solution. So you'll see these zones in blue representing about 1/3 of the ocean as protected. So that was the approach that we took in Barbuda. So science-based there looked like before we did our ecological assessment, making sure that the local staff were trained to dive and that we donated dive gear and taught them how to maintain that, and then they went out and did the research alongside the scientists. As far as community-driven, that meant 22 meetings with the local government, interviewing all of the fishermen, interviewing the elders, hosting 7 town hall meetings over the course of a year and a half. And then people who don't come to town hall meetings, we went to them. So for me, if there's one picture to summarize the work that I have done and aspire to continue doing, it's this photograph. So here you'll see I have interrupted a dominoes game. And there are 2 fishermen in this photo. There's an immigrations officer, there's a fisheries officer, there's a GIS and mapping expert, there's an enforcement technology expert, and there's me sitting there trying to figure out using paper maps, but also a computer that can map all these different layers of data, trying to figure out where they want these zones to be. They're going to be the ones that draw the lines. If they're not going to come to the community meetings, we're going to screech to a halt on the side of the road to get their input. So I went in, and being the naive outsider, I came up with this list of 12 recommendations of things that I thought this community should implement in order to have sustainable ocean management and to restore their ecosystems. But I think one of the things I'm proudest of is how much the final regulations were different from my original recommendations, because to me this is proof that we were actually listening to the community. So the one of these I'll point out is that I had initially recommended that a lagoon be permanently closed to fishing because it was their most important nursery habitat that sustains future fishing. Instead, it ended up that was closed for 2 years and would be reopened with a management plan based on scientific research conducted over those 2 years. And I noticed right before the regulations got signed into law, I noticed that there are all these kids after school who would go down and fish on the pier in the lagoon, just with a hook and line, rarely ever catching things. And I thought, if this government bans all fishing in that lagoon, this is going to be banned. This like one wholesome thing that kids can do after school, and all the mothers are going to come after me. And for no reason, this is not the sustainability problem. So there is now an exception for hook and line fishing from shore that's been written in. So this is the first zoning map that the government drew. The fishermen said, that's a terrible idea, here's our version. And then that is the third and final draft. So things really evolved over time. And these are the only 2 pieces of data that ended up being useful. We had lots of different data layers, but in the end, all we needed were a map of the habitats, because we recommended that you protect a third of each different type of habitat and a third of the area overall. And you can decide what happens in all the other zones based on the habitat type in part. But then I interviewed all of the fishermen on the island and figured out where they fished and developed this heat map of fishing pressure, so that if you want to think about how much you're displacing people or what the economic impacts of different zoning options would be, you could use this data as a key part of that. And I should say this island is small. There's only 1,500 people. There's not a lot of other industry going on. Otherwise, you'd need to do similar maps for tourism and other major uses. So this is what the final version looks like. You have these blue zones that, this is out to 3 miles around the island. The blue zones represent a third of their waters protected. The green are anchoring areas that are only in sand. The pink are areas that are around the reef where no nets could be used. Fishermen noticed that the nets were destroying the reefs. So that was their idea, to prevent nets being used on the reefs. And they actually added a protected area at the end around another lagoon that is an important nursery habitat. So this is, to me, like, how do you use technology for ocean conservation? This is that for me. It's every line on this map was drawn by members of the community. And so this is obvious to anybody who thinks about these things, but this was really a revelation for me, that ocean conservation is not actually about fish at all. It's really about people. And so my question going forward, as I'm working on urban ocean conservation, what does that look like in New York City? How do we do ocean conservation in a way that centers social justice, is thinking about people and cultural change and behavioral change and inclusivity, and maybe a small role for technology in that process.
Thank you. Next, we're going to hear from Kenneth Bailey, who is the co-founder of the Design Studio for Social Intervention. We're going to show a little bit of a video, and then he's going to give us some context. This is a video of a new model that they put together called the Social Emergency Response Center.
Yep, it's true.
The horrifying Trump win underscores the fact that we're all living in a social emergency, even if it affects each of us differently. In other kinds of emergencies like earthquakes or tsunamis, hurricanes, there's emergency response centers to help coordinate food, shelter, information. So we felt like we needed a social emergency response center to take on the real and pressing social emergencies that we are facing right now.
We're creating a space where people can come in and express how they're feeling and then pivot into collective action. By the time people leave, we want them to be able to express what they're doing.
With Trump trying to dangerously narrow the definition of what it means to be an American, Cirques are places where you can bring your whole damn self. We welcome everyone, from frontline activists to local neighbors, artists, healers, children, and concerned allies. The Cirque is a place where folks can feed their mind, body, and spirit. Cirques include creative action, healing, collective art making, cooking, performances, and more. In emergencies, we need information. The plotting room includes our political workshops, our radical library, and interactive ways of reimagining this work. We're figuring out how we're tracking the storm and how we're reconstructing democracy after it.
Cirques help us recognize we're in a social emergency. They're an orientation space. They help us move from despair, rage, and hopelessness into collective radical action.
Instead of being a space where there's actually room for exchange and you can actually see the change happening.
That may be interesting to know that outside of the space, I don't remember the prospect. It's one of the events there.
The Cirque is an idea of bringing people together to reflect of what is happening in other space, to then reflect how can we organize what we should do, and I think that is an idea that's going to spread.
Boston was just the beginning. Communities around the country are beginning to plan their own social emergency response efforts.
Want to join us? Contact us at cirque@ds4si.org, and we'll send you a Cirque kit to help you get started. It's true. It's over. Get it up. Make it go. Stop. There we go. Hi, everybody. So, I'm Kenneth Bailey, and I'm one of the people who helped create Cirque. We're part of a large organization called Design Studio for Social Intervention. It exists to help people in the social justice sector be more creative and culturally relevant in how we come to describe problems and therefore solve them. My what do you call that thingy? My Twitter thingy is at @ds4si. If you want to follow us on Twitter, I love that thingy. I love getting followed. And we're in a social emergency. We started doing this work about 2 years ago, really as a response to what we felt was happening inside of state-sanctioned violence. We noticed that lots of communities of color were organizing to really address state-sanctioned violence, and a lot of our white allies were either confused, feeling awkward, not knowing how to make sense of it, not knowing what to do. And one of the things we wanted people to understand is that this wasn't a black problem or even a police problem, it's a civil society problem. And we need a way to recognize rogue governance as we need to see it as a symptom of something, not just as this sort of enclosed problem with something happening to a set of people. But we notice that we don't have the muscle, the infrastructure, the sort of cognitive infrastructure, the procedures with which to know how to respond and not sit in awkwardness. And so we wrote this paper called We wrote this paper called Building a Case for Social Emergency Procedures. A really good friend of ours, Mindy Fullilove, who wrote a wonderful book called Root Shock, read our paper and was like, you guys got to keep moving, like you're onto something here. So Mindy told us to keep working, and when Mindy Fullilove tells you to keep working, you keep working. And so we did a set of interventions on these mobile, movable boxes. And one side it said how to recognize a social emergency, and on the other side it said what to do when faced with one. I mean, that was still to try to bring, to try to help create the muscle inside of our society for when we're facing times when we all need to act, we know what those times are and what to do. And we just kept getting hit. DAPL happened. I mean, the Flint water crisis happened. And then, we were worried that everybody was going to settle down because we thought Hillary was going to win and that we were going to have to put these social emergency response centers out as a way to keep people engaged. Like, we thought people were going to step away and go, Hillary won, it's all fine. And that didn't happen. We had another outcome, and which actually pulled more people in and now recognizing the social emergency. But the problem is everybody thinks that the social emergency is just Trump. Trump is also another symptom of the social emergency, but it's across our parties, it's across our platforms, it's out here with us. It's even inside of the tech world. I mean, the stuff that Zainab described yesterday, Trump isn't moving forward those, what did she refer to that was? Those 21st century persuasion architectures? That's not Trump, that's us. That's this world, that's the tech world. So the social emergency is across a lot of different platforms, and it requires us to build our capacity to actually maintain our society, to like start to do societal maintenance. And we don't know how to do that right now. So we have a really conceptually and practically and socially muddy society, and it's showing in all of our stuff. So social emergency response centers are our contribution in trying to help us figure out how to get in a relationship with each other, how to figure out how to do societal maintenance management, how to reconnect with each other, and how to proceed from there. We don't see this as the end, we see it as the beginning. And again, if you'd like to do one, all you have to do is email us, and we'll send you a manual and it describes how to do it, and then we send you a kit with all the little information in it, and you can do it in your house, you can do it in your church, you can do it in your synagogue, you can do it at your mosque, you can do it in your organization, on a street corner. And yeah, that's it for me. Looking forward to hearing more from you guys, and thanks so much.
Our next presenter, this is May, and May Al Hassan. She actually just presented what we're about to see at TED just this week, and she received her PhD in American Studies and Ethnicity from.
So we hear about a refugee crisis. What I'm going to suggest to you is that it's not necessarily a refugee crisis. What the turning point we have in this moment is the turning point between nation states and old, outdated, archaic institutions. So in 2008 in Greece, so my work has been with refugees in Greece and Turkey, and this is Athens. 2008, when the economic crisis hit in Greece, there was an emergence of fascism, but there was also a resurgence of anarchism. And what happened was that when refugees came flooding into Greece, that was like the prime opportunity for anarchists to envision a borderless world. So they took abandoned hotels and squats and reformatted them and repurposed them to house not just refugees, but to become community centers, have medical supply stock, and they're very much anti-statist approaches, anti-the UN, anti-NGOs. As you can see here, their big emphasis is on freedom of movement. And sorry for how blurry it is, but it says this is one in a refugee area in Athens called Victoria, and it's called City Plaza. And I think I just heard that the Greek government is trying to evict everybody from this building. It says City Plaza is a self-organized squad, does not belong to the state or to any of the NGOs. So what's interesting about this space too is they emphasize solidarity horizontally and not top-down approach like the UN tries to take, and I'm about to show you what happens when you take a UN approach. This is one of the camps. It's called Skaramagas. It's 45 minutes outside of Athens. Does anybody know what that is? Anything? Food. They threw away all the UN meals because in their minds it's disgusting, especially if you come, so my parents are from Syria, some of the best food in the world, and for them to get these prepackaged meals that in a lot of cases people were experiencing food poisoning, they didn't want that. And they said to me, why couldn't the UN just give us a couple of euros a day and we can make our own food? Which is what they did. This is what their food looks like in the camps as opposed to this. You can see the difference. And so people are getting paid off of creating these meals. Contractors, the Greek government is making so much money off this crisis. And it's the people that are suffering from it, and this is their self-organized response. Not to get into too many details, but we can take this into the Q&A. I just want you to imagine that this is a crisis of the nation state, not the human moving. It's the crisis of the creation of borders that were really only solidified in between World War I and World War II afterwards. That's why we say it's the biggest refugee crisis since World War II, because we really didn't have solidified borders. So the issue of people moving around wasn't an issue until we wanted to give them papers and contain them. And so this is at one of the islands that people stop through from Turkey when they migrate, and this is a sign that says no borders, no nations. You can't really see the yellow, but I love that messaging. So I want you to think about a time before borders, a time before nation states, and I think I'm just going to occupy this place right here because I have a pretty loud projecting voice to do the poem. Are you all up for it?